So let us move to the third talk for today in today's session. A talk by Jonathan Greig from the University of Leuven. Let me say a few words about Jonathan. Well, he is, as you know, the author of an interesting monograph on the first principle in late Platonism, a study of one's causality in Proclus and Damascius, published in the Philosophia Antiqua series in 2021. Well, Jonathan works also not only on Neoplatonism, but also on medieval philosophy, on Nicolaus of Methoni, and Maximus the Confessor, and the reception of Neoplatonism in Byzantium, in Byzantine philosophy. And today he is going to talk about sort of his main sort of topic in research, namely Damascius and the first principle, Damascius the One, and the Parmenides first and second hypotheses. Well, thank you, Jonathan, for joining us. There is a handout circulated on your emails, which is, I guess, crucial for the talk. Jonathan, I hand over to you.
Oh, thank you, George. Thank you. I assume almost everyone has, hopefully everyone has the handout. So basically my talk, it picks up on a number of themes from Alinka's last talk. Basically dealing with this question of negations, and then this relates to how the one relates to the first and second hypotheses from Proclus, and how I think they have, at least my hypothesis is Damascius uses that in talking about the relation between the ineffable and the one, at least as he talks about it. Okay, so I will begin my paper here. As is well known to Plato and Neoplatonism scholars, the second part of Plato's Parmenides poses a long perplexing series of deductions sketched out in 8 or 9 hypotheses concerning the form of the one in relation to its opposite, the many. Of interest for us today are the Neoplatonist interpretations of the hypotheses, which took the one in each case to refer to different subjects rather than as referring to one and the same subject alone, something we see Proclus assert in his Parmenides commentary in Book 6, when criticizing those who take the one postulated in only one sense. For Proclus, of the 9 hypotheses that he numbers, the first 5 indicate real existent principles, namely the first indicates unity itself, or to auto n, the one itself. The second indicates the intelligible realm. The third indicates the level of soul in all souls. The fourth indicates forms in matter, and the fifth indicates matter in itself. Although the subject matter of each hypothesis is separate, the Neoplatonists, generally speaking, understand each hypothesis as causally interrelated with each other, such that each hypothesis either anticipates its subsequents or harkens back to its antecedents. This is particularly the case for the first and second hypotheses of interest for us today, insofar as Proclus considers the second hypothesis as revealing the principal being in all beings, including the ones or henads as the proximate principles of the classes of being, and the first hypothesis as revealing the first principle of all beings, that is, the one itself, to auto n. Just taking Plato's text by itself, one can see Proclus's argument mapped out when comparing the negations and assertions between the first and second hypotheses, which I have on the first page of my handout, just in summary form. One can see the mutual correlation between each attribute negated and affirmed between both hypotheses. Whereas other earlier Platonists, like Origen the Platonist, hold that the first hypothesis indicates the absolute non-existence of a principle, that is, no subject matter, which has pure negations predicated of it, which is also not some common view or somewhat common view in current Plato scholarship. By contrast, Proclus takes the negations to imply a causal relation to the affirmations that appear in the principle belonging to the second hypothesis, so indicating a real subject which generates those affirmations. In other words, the positive attributes there depend on a principle that transcends those attributes, hence the appropriateness of negations. We see this in the handouts in T3, where Proclus states his position that the first hypothesis' negations are generative of the second hypothesis' affirmations, mapping onto the causality of the one in producing being with its positive affirmations. Here I read, "But if it is useful to state my opinion in brief, I would say that even as the one is the cause of wholes, so also negations are the causes of affirmations. For this reason, as many things as the second hypothesis affirms, as we have said earlier, the first denies such things, for all those positive affirmations proceed from these negations, and the cause of all these is the one, as being prior to all things. For just as the soul, being bodiless, produces the body, and as the intellect, even though unsouled, since it is also not a soul, brings to existence the soul, even so the one, while not being itself pluralized, brings to existence every plurality. And although it is not number, it brings to existence number, and though it is not shape, it brings to existence shape, and similarly in the case of the others. For it is none of the things belonging to which it brings to existence, since no other cause is the same as its own products. If then it, the one, is none of those things which it brings to existence, and it brings to existence everything, it is none of all things. If then we know all things in an affirmative way, kataphatikos, we reveal that principle in a negative way, apophatikos, from each entity among all things, and in this way, this form of negation is generative of the plurality of affirmations. Here, Proclus uses the examples of soul as not body and intellect as not soul, as respectively producing body and soul, to illustrate his point about the one producing being's attributes, without itself being characterized by those attributes. Although the one has the attributes it produces negated of it, they point to the determinative effects from a transcendent cause. In this sense, we can see Proclus's claim that the negations are generative, they're genetikon, of the affirmations. I focus on Proclus until now, although the main focus of my talk will be Damascius, because it is from Proclus's foundation that Damascius introduces his innovation of splitting the Neoplatonic first principle into two, that is, between the purely ineffable, detached from all causality of beings, and the one as the cause of beings. This is a perplexing move for a reader of Proclus and other Neoplatonists. Even positing the oneness beyond being, one would think, is enough to secure the principle's transcendence. However, a central factor behind this, and one of the main theses I'd like to consider in my talk, is that the one anticipates the features that it produces. Our text already indicates this, or implies this. Although the negations detach the one from its effects down to the final negation of the negations, which you can see referenced in T2 from the end of the first hypothesis in the Parmenides, nevertheless, the negations suggest a necessary relation to the affirmations which proceed from the first hypothesis as one. Carlo Steele, in his 1999 article, The Negatio Negationis, put this summarily when he pointed to the tension in Proclus's interpretation of the first hypothesis' final negation. On the one hand, it shows as the one's nature as totally ineffable, as completely detached from the analysis we just carried out. But on the other hand, the one still remains the subject of a dialectical analysis, as the identifiable and then, in this sense, speakable starting point from which the second hypothesis' affirmations proceed. True, the negations alone say more about ourselves than about the principle, inasmuch as their purpose is ultimately to orient the soul around the one's nature as ineffable, something we'll look at shortly. The main question, on the other hand, is how we are to understand the one's ineffability. Is it the result simply of the negations, especially the negation of those negations, as Proclus seems to conclude, or is that ineffability rather presupposed as the background to the negations posited for the one? As we will see, this is Damascius's position, and it is this aspect that I would like to consider in his analysis of the first hypothesis as one. The thesis I would like to consider in my talk is effectively this. Just as Proclus holds a two-fold reading of the one between the first and the second hypothesis, as respectively first transcending and second corresponding with the kinds and classes of beings, so Damascius adapts this two-fold reading for the first hypothesis as one. That is, first the ineffable, that is, the first principle, as entirely detached from being in all things, which does not correspond to the dialectical analysis of the Parmenides hypotheses. And second, the one proper, that is, the subject of the first hypothesis, which is the principle considered as coordinated with its effect being in all things. In this latter case, the one's ineffability that Parmenides concludes with, that is, with the first hypothesis' final negation, is inherited by the ineffable first principle prior to the first hypothesis, much in the same way that the second hypothesis is one, the henads for Proclus and also Damascius inherit their unity from the first hypothesis as one, while directly anticipating the features of the specific classes of being that they produce. So first we'll look at more at what Proclus has to say about the nature of negations applying to the one, and how they pertain to the one as well as our souls, that is in what way we do or don't grasp it. And then after this, we will then review Damascius' reading of Parmenides and the final negation, and his argument that there must be a distinction between the one, which we remain with at the first hypothesis ends, and the ineffable, which is entirely prior and removed from the hypothesis. So in the first place, it is worth looking briefly, going back over how Proclus thinks a negation does not just imply something lower than affirmation, that is, privation or similar, and why negations are appropriate for the one, even if definitions normally should be characterized by affirmations. This we see in text 4, T4, on the handouts, when Proclus considers a hypothetical position that affirmations are indeed better for the one. After all, he says, a negation is a privation, while an affirmation, they say, involves the presence in a particular possession of form. Who the intended they are in the first paragraph is not clarified in the text, but Proclus likely has in mind Aristotle's critique of using negations for definitions of forms and topics, Book 6, Chapter 6, and the parts of animals, Book 1, Chapter 3. On this view, negation does not simply imply superiority as indicative of a genus, for instance, but only refers to privation of the proper function of a nature, such as being blind, or a species-making difference, such as length indicating what is without breadth, which is differentiated from length with breadth. That is, both length without and with breadth fall into the genus of length. However, as we can see in the second paragraph of T4, Proclus denies that this is only one use here. In particular, insofar as there is a sense of non-being which implies something transcending being as such, negation can also refer to the sense as transcending an affirmation. In one way, this would be like a kind of super-affirmation. For example, in the case of souls as causes of living bodies, they produce the structure and order of each body, and especially of motion and life in bodies, and in the sense one might say that they are bodily in the kind of effect that they produce, and on the other hand, they are greater than body, being incorporeal by their nature, such that applying the negation of bodiless, the negative attribute bodiless or incorporeal, does not imply a privation of body, but rather the opposite, as something superior to body. This is the kind of case Proclus thinks of, as we saw earlier in T3, carried over to the one and its negations. It's worth paying attention to Proclus's next qualification, just after a passage in T5, where he argues that there is a twofold sense of non-being, the first paragraphs of which I'll read here. But since this type of non-being is also twofold, the one participated by being, the other being reckoned together with beings, it is clear that in the case of this latter, neither affirmation nor negation is fitting, properly speaking, whereas in the case of the former, negation is more appropriate, and also affirmation, insofar as it has connection with beings. Yet if no statement is properly true of that other, I mean that entity which is unconnected with being, at least negation is more properly uttered of it than affirmation. For even affirmations are about beings, negations are about non-being. For in general, an affirmation means laying hold of some form, and when the soul says that one thing is present to another and makes an affirmation, it postulates something belonging to things of the same kind as itself. The first is, however, above form, and it is not suitable to apply to it any of those attributes which are in secondary things, nor to transfer to it attributes proper to ourselves, for we will find ourselves talking about ourselves and not it. So what's noteworthy here is that there's not simply one sense of non-being which indicates transcendence or privation also in relation to being, but rather this other second sense as not being reckoned together with beings, tode udini ton onton sonarithmumenon. In this case, Proclus seems to include all three senses of negations from the previous T4 here, where they obtain, strictly speaking, only for the sense of non-being participated by them. It's also noteworthy that all statements, both negations and affirmations, do not apply to the second kind of non-being, anticipating what he will say about the one. And yet Proclus concedes, if one does speak, negations are still more appropriate. And then finally, the last part of the paragraph is very important for when we look at Damascius. Proclus here argues that affirmations in corresponding to some kind of being are drawn by the soul making postulations which, in his words, belong to things of the same kind as itself, ton heaute sungenon. If we apply affirmations to the one, then we will find ourselves talking about ourselves and not it, in his words, which implicitly the negations of the first hypothesis are supposed to facilitate. But also noteworthy here is that Proclus does not think negations have this problem. If anything, they detach the soul from the things that are sungenon heaute. We see this in the second paragraph when Proclus says that for affirmations strive to ascertain that some one thing is true of some other, whereas the first is both inaccessible to cognitions, which are related to beings, and it is not possible to take anything as applying to it, but rather as not applying to it, for it transcends every composition and participation. Again, it is interesting that Proclus does not state negations having this problem, even in the superlative sense, as indicating transcendent principles. This methodological point will be important when we see Damascius' analysis of negations and affirmations for the soul in relation to the one. This background is also important when we consider Proclus' interpretation of the twofold distinction between the one and the first and the second hypotheses. Proclus here follows his master Syrianus' interpretation against Iamblichus and others, perhaps, who consider the first hypothesis subject matter as including both God and the gods, or the one itself and the henads. For Syrianus and Proclus, Iamblichus' view is problematic since the henads imply a direct connection to their effects. In some ways, they're implied within their effects, and they positively precontain the corresponding affirmations that they produce in their respective classes of beings, which is not the case for the one. We can see this in reading T6, which I'll read here. The fact that all those things which are stated affirmatively in the second hypothesis are presented negatively in the first indicates that the primal cause transcends all the divine orders, while they have proceeded in various ways according to their various distinct characteristics. For the one in the second hypothesis is neither the primal one, for it is complex in being all things, nor is it that which is inseparable from being, and thus, as being a state of it, is in it. Parmenides thus clearly distinguishes the one from the first, and declares that this one, being such as it is distinct. It is clear, in fact, that this term is indicative of a self-complete divine henads. For every transcendent cause of the head of a plurality produces a double plurality, one which is separate like itself, and another which is unseparated, that is, immanent in its participants. So one can recognize here Proclus's principle, spelled out in the Elements of Theology's Proposition 64, and then enunciated in other places, that every separated transcendent cause produces two kinds of terms or entities corresponding to their participants, that is, as self-complete existences, autoteles hypostases, and eliminations, elampses, immanent within their participants. And noteworthy in our text is Proclus's view that the second hypothesis is one, that is, the henads, indicate the first separated kind of entity, which is a self-complete hypostasis. Similarly, in Proclus's understanding, each henad mirrors the one's nature in its own being, except insofar as it is participated in contrast to the one. For Proclus, the henad's correlativity to its effects, even if existing separately from the effects, means that it anticipates and precontains the affirmation which it produces in being. We see this elsewhere in Proclus, such as in the Elements Proposition 118, which claims that the henad's attributes pre-exist, they profustikin, in them according to their unique character, their idiotes, which is unitary and above being, heniaia kai huberusios. In this latter respect, the henads inherit the one's character, yet in the respect in which the henads exist, in terms of their unique character, their idiotes, they are correlative to their effects. For Proclus, it is this aspect by which each henad is relatively participated, and again the reason why they are distinguished from the one itself, which is entirely unparticipated, which we can see from our text from T6 and other places like the Elements Proposition 116. So now we can see Proclus's two-sided sense of the one between the first and second hypothesis, where the one and the henads mirror each other in their unity. They are distinguished according to the angle at which one looks at the unity between both entities, either considered in itself as apart from being, which is the case in the first hypothesis, or considered in relation to the beings which participate their respective unity, that is, in the second hypothesis. Given this twofold sense, we may go back to the tension of Proclus's relation of relating the one with its ineffable nature, which I was referencing earlier. One may wonder how the one can be said to be ineffable when we have the first hypothesis' negations added up. It would seem they still assert something, perhaps. And Proclus seems aware of this potential objection when he frames the way in which the negations apply to the one in a twofold way in T7, not as directly about or around the one, again, referring to this language of peritochen or peritouchenos as referring to the one, which Jelinka was referencing earlier. Here I read from T7. So he, that is namely Parmenides, rightly added at the end of these negations, at the end, that these negations do not express anything about the one. For being as referring to the one, peritouchenos, is one thing, while being as about the one, peritouchen, is another. The argument is not about the one, for it is undefinable, but it refers to the one, the latter belonging to things stated among ourselves as itself ineffable. So the negative propositions that have been stated are not about the one, but refer to the one. This is why they resemble neither those attributes belonging to intelligibles, nor those which belong to sensibles. For the former are about the same things of which the negations are also predicated, while the latter are not in any way about the one. Proclus's distinction here harkens back to common usage among earlier Neoplatonists, going back to Plotinus in the 5.3.14, who says that we do not speak the one auton, but we speak as referring to the one, as peri autou. So again, the genitive versus the accusative cases of peri. Proclus uses this distinction to show how the one is undefinable peritouchen in itself, but as we saw earlier, the negations point us towards its direction, hence peritouchenos, as turning away from the corresponding attributes pertaining to intelligibles and sensible objects. In this sense, the one's ineffable status is respected, while the negations turn the soul towards the one as entirely ineffable, something we see with the final negation, as Proclus states at the end of the Parmenides commentary in T8, when he shows how the silence that follows the negation of all the negations refers to the one considered alone, that is, as entirely ineffable. Although this distinction in some way helps, inasmuch as negations on Proclus's reading do not encroach on the one's ineffability, there still may in some way remain the question how the first hypothesis' subject matter, if it is entirely ineffable in its nature, still remains the same subject of dialectical analysis. If all the attributes of being go back to the one of the first hypothesis, regardless of the henads role in the second hypothesis, how does one explain the emergence of these attributes, even as negations starting with the subject of the first hypothesis? How or in what respect can the one be ineffable, wholly, or in some respects? It's interesting that Proclus does not push this question, which, and perhaps fitting that Proclus' successor in Athens, the last Theodokos Damascius, does end up addressing, which we will see next here. The central text where we see Damascius raising questions, or aporiae, about the one, and in what sense it is and is not the first principle, is addressed in Western Comis's Volume 1 of the De Principiis, especially the first 61 pages, dealing with the one in relation to the ineffable as a separate principle. Damascius notably does not give a demonstration for the ineffable, nor does his discussion in general proceed from first premises to conclusions, especially the way that Proclus generally proceeds, but instead gives dialectical arguments showing how the one may be considered the first principle if and only if it is considered by itself. For example, in De Principiis in Book 1, Volume 1, pages 325 to 45. But when considered as a cause of all things, ta panta, then a distinction is necessitated by positing another absolutely transcendent principle, which would be the ineffable. One place we see this is in his discussion of the Parmenides final, the first hypothesis is final negation. In T9, we find Damascius initially following Proclus's train of thought, granting that the final negation reveals to us the one's ineffability. Here I read, for the one, Plato says, if it is in no way one, but if it is not one account will be joined to it so that there is no negation, but there is no name, for this is not simple. There is also no particular account or knowledge of it, for these are not simple, and intellect itself is not even simple, so that the one is absolutely unknowable and ineffable. Why then should we search for something else beyond the ineffable? Damascius here explicitly considers two angles for the one. Either if it is not one, estine or hen estine, that is with the predicative is estine, it has all the negations applied to it, such as having no accounts, no name, and so on. Damascius also considers if it is not simply, that is, educ estine, so if the one itself is negated, not just being one, where no negations would then apply. And here it's notable that Damascius paraphrases some of the conclusions of the first hypothesis with the first angle, considering if the one is not one, while he finishes the conclusions by asking what more when we search for beyond the ineffable, as epikenatou aritou. Indeed, Damascius's words almost directly allude to places in Proclus's commentary and other texts, such as the Elements of Theology, Proposition 12, where Proclus challenges the idea, but coming from Iamblichus, that there should be a higher principle beyond to auto n. So far, though, Damascius seems to agree with the idea at this point in the text. But then we go to our next line from T10. We see the consequences of Damascius settling on the second option of negating the one entirely. So if it is not simply educ estine, in reference to Parmenides 141 E9 to 10, that the one in no way is udamos aresti to hen. And here I read T10. We say forthwith that Plato, through the middle term of the one, has brought us in an ineffable way to the now set forward ineffable beyond the one, namely the removal itself of the one, just as in this way, by negation of the other deductions, he has brought us around to the one. For Plato has shown in the Sophists that the one is purified in a certain affirmation by showing that it presubsists being in itself. However, the reason why Plato remained silent after reaching the point of the one is that he felt it appropriate to maintain absolute silence, as is the ancient custom with regard to what is absolutely secret. Damascius here draws a twofold distinction between the one and the ineffable beyond the one, made explicit in the Parmenides' first hypothesis with this line about the removal of the one, and Damascius' interpretation applied in the Sophist with the silence of the ineffable besides the ones mentioned. At the same time, Damascius affirms Proclus's framework for the one itself being indicated by both the negations and the last negation of those negations. We can also see a nod to Proclus in Damascius' language of our being brought around, periegagen, to the one, corresponding to Proclus's notion that the negations refer to the one, again, this language of peri to henos, but do not directly indicate or impute the one, peri to hen. However, unlike Proclus, Damascius takes Plato's line from Parmenides 141, E9 to 10, as directly referencing an entity besides the one, even if the one is also ineffable in its nature. Why, we may ask here, does Damascius not fully follow Proclus's twofold distinction between peri to henos and peri to hen? One might think that this addresses the first hypothesis line about the one being entirely removed. This only speaks to what is peri to henos, not peri to hen, as removing the subject itself. However, we find a clue in T11 when Damascius frames the one in relation to what is absolutely ineffable. Here I read, and the ineffable, the absolutely ineffable, is in no way ineffable in such a way that ineffable, as the term, is posed concerning it, while the one is in such a way as to escape, that it escapes from every composition of definition and name, and from every distinction as that of knowledge from the thing known. Yet in another sense, the one is conceived as the simplest and most all-encompassing, and it is not only one, as is the characteristic of the henads, but the one is conceived as all things and one before all things, and not a particular one among all things. In the first sentence, Damascius appears to do away with the twofold distinction of peri to henos and peri to hen when it comes to the ineffable. No predicate applies affirmative or negative by contrast to the one, where negative predication is allowed. In this sense, he abstracts the ineffable aspects from the one as something which remains completely outside the scope of analysis, in contrast to the one. And we may ask why this is necessary here. And the second sentence indicates something for us here. For Damascius, the one must be conceived in some sense, even if in a negative or transcendent way, as the simplest and most all-encompassing in relation to its effect of all things or being and beings. It seems that posing the henads as Proclus's solution is not enough. These only tell us about the proximate causes of particular classes of beings, But what about the proximate cause of all beings unqualifiedly, or just all things to panta as such? This shows a drastic change in how the one is understood compared to Proclus, where Proclus has the internal tension of dealing with the one as inconceivable, and yet, with the first hypothesis negations, anticipating their corresponding affirmations in the second hypothesis. In some way, the one is or must be conceived in relation to its effects. And this comes out later on in the De Principiis in T12, where Damascius emphasizes the issue of the one remaining a subject of analysis at the end of the first hypothesis, even if its ineffability is affirmed. Here I just read from T12. That one is the principle of all things. Plato also, in the Parmenides, having reverted to the principle, did not need another principle in the arguments. For that ineffable principle is not a principle of arguments nor of knowledge, since it is neither a principle of lives, nor of beings, nor of ones, but of all things simply speaking, posited above every thought. Therefore he did not make any indication concerning that principle, but from the one he made negations of all other things except the one itself. For in the final place he denied its being one, but not the one. In addition to this, he denied the negation itself, but not the one, and every name, thoughts, and knowledge he denied. And what more could one say? He denied being itself, whole and entire, yes, even the unified and the unitary, and if one wishes, the unlimited and limits, the two primary principles, but he did not in the least deny the one that is beyond all of these. And therefore he posits it in the Sophist as the one before being, and in the Republic he posits it as the good beyond all being, but nevertheless only the one is left remaining. So it's here that we see Damascius emphasize the one remaining as an identifiable starting point for all things, and thus for the ensuing analysis and procession of beings in the Parmenides hypotheses, which he also connects to the Sophist mention of the one, again, and the Republic's good. The ineffable principle, on the other hand, as Damascius points out, is not subject to any analysis and is not indicated in the hypothesis in the way the one is, even after the final negation is made. It's interesting here that, unlike earlier at De Principiis 9, lines 10 to 18, so earlier text 10, T10, Damascius denies that Parmenides removed the one, even if it seems at 141, E9 to 10 in the Parmenides. Although his analysis may be different here from earlier, in this case taking all the first hypothesis statements as referring to the same subjects, including the so-called removal of the one. What is at least clear between these two texts is that Damascius is at pains to emphasize an implicit distinction in the hypothesis between pure ineffability and the one as only relatively ineffable, and in the sense only relatively transcendent. This we see made clear in the next page in T13, the next page of the De Principiis in text 13 on our handout, where Damascius states more clearly why he thinks the one cannot be posited as entirely ineffable, at least in the way that Proclus appears to think it can. Either then the one is noble and sayable, or it is unnoble and ineffable, or it is in some sense both, and in another sense neither. Indeed, by means of negations, one could speak of it, while by means of affirmation it is ineffable. And again, the one could be knowable or conjecturable by simple knowledge, but entirely unknowable by compound knowledge. That is why it is not graspable even by a negation. And generally, insofar as it is posited as one, by this it has been coordinated in some sense with things posited in some other way, since it is the summit, coryphe, of things which subsist by position. And in the same way there is much in the one which is ineffable, unknowable, uncoordinated, and without position, but with the faint reflection and facils of their opposites, while those attributes are better than the latter. Either those characters which are greater are in the one according to subsistence, kathapaxin, and how will the opposites exist together there, or they are in the one according to participation, katamethexi, and they come from elsewhere, from the first which is such. Therefore, even before the one is what is simply and entirely ineffable, without position, uncoordinated, and inconceivable according to every mode. Damascius's argument for distinguishing the ineffable from the one comes down to two factors. The first is addressing whether the one is entirely unknowable and ineffable, and in this sense truly first, or noble and sayable, or some mixture of the two. It is notable here that Damascius takes negations as contrary to ineffability. In effect, if the negation is supposed to lead to ineffability, as detaching oneself or the soul from affirmations, the negation still requires something asserted. Although Proclus would not necessarily disagree here, he does not seem to think that negations threaten the one's ineffability in the way that affirmations do. Damascius, by contrast, appears to argue that the assertion of negations implies a conditional ineffability. If we compare this with Proclus's methodological warning about the soul and affirmations earlier from T5, there is a subtle but important shift. Damascius here and elsewhere shows that even negations also pertain in some way to things that are the same in kind as the soul itself, namely in terms of they're implying their opposite corresponding affirmations. This leads to the second, more developed factor, whether the one is known or unknown, although not grasped by complex knowledge, it can be known by, as he calls it, simple knowledge. This seems to go with Damascius's next argument, that since the one is conceived as the summit, the koryphē of things with a position, such as the henads or classes of beings and so on, it then implies a reflection, emphasis of its opposites, as sayable, combination of sayable or effable and ineffable, knowable, unknowable, coordinated, uncoordinated, and so on. This leads to his conclusion that if it indeed precontains these sets of opposites, the better attributes, that is pure ineffability, unknowability, and so on, must come from another distinct principle, so hence the ineffable. It is this text which shows, I believe, the direct parallel to Proclus's twofold analysis of the one between the first and second hypotheses. Just as for Proclus, the second hypothesis is one as an intermediary between the first hypothesis one and being, and all beings, here also for Damascius, the one is an intermediary between the ineffable, as entirely transcendent and be outside the domain of the Parmenides hypotheses, and the subsequent hypotheses after the one of the first hypothesis. We've already seen this language of Damascius emphasizing the one status as a meson, a middle term, between the ineffable and all things, as such. We also see this, for instance, in T14, where Damascius refers to the ineffable as a sanctuary, aduton of the one, and as, in his words, ineffably producing all things in the same way, aporiton aporitos, to panta homoios, in contrast to the subsequent principles of the one producing plurality, the unified producing differentiated beings, and so on. Of course, even after Damascius emphasizes his prohibition that any attribute can pertain to the ineffable, he emphasizes the inherently paradoxical nature of speaking of the ineffable as overturning itself, overturning oneself. So the soul engaging in predicating attributes that, of course, it knows it cannot predicate, and this language of overturning a peritropos, such that the language of negations, affirmations, or any statements truly do not pertain to the ineffable. Although Proclus also recognizes the paradoxical nature of language in relation to the one of the first hypothesis, it is nevertheless, inasmuch as it is the beginning of a series of principles and entities discussed in the second and ensuing hypotheses of the Parmenides, that the one cannot be subject to the full force of this paradoxical language of overturning, which otherwise pertains to the ineffable apart from the hypotheses. And that could also be a separate topic of discussion later on. But for now, in sum, we can see how Damascius considers the relation between the ineffable and the one in light of Proclus's own two-sided reading for the one of the first and second hypotheses. If the one is taken as beyond the negations and in having its being one denied of it, it is still the beginning and starting point from which the specific assertions proceeds in the second hypothesis. If, however, the one is considered entirely apart from the hypotheses in its purely ineffable states, such that it is not ukastin simply, then it is transcendent and separate from the first hypothesis as one, as the ground for the second hypothesis is one and all subsequent hypotheses. These two readings are, I have attempted to argue, an extension of Proclus's two-sided reading for the one of the first and second hypotheses, taken in itself as apart from being and taken as directly related to and attached to being. Damascius, in effect, takes Proclus's principles one step further and applies them in a way that considers both the subjects in themselves and especially the side of human reasoning in which the Parmenides hypotheses are considered. And here I finish, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was great, very condensed. Well, this is all very interesting for a number of reasons. one thing about, because this somehow this discourse underlines the limits of language in describing reality. So we have here a Platonist stressing in a way that is somehow like sort of the skeptics, how aporetic we should be, how sort of skeptical we can be when we deal with the highest principle. Of course, he is not a skeptic, but there is sort of a genuine aporia regarding the nature of the first principle, which apparently cannot be sufficiently and answered and dealt with at the end, cannot be superseded, so to speak. So the aporia remains, and that is something that pertains to our reality and to the nature of that first principle. So I think that is sort of, namely, the fact that there is something in our reality, and indeed something which is the source of everything, which is not entirely, well, it's not accessible to our understanding. I think that sort of poses a major philosophical question.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, George. Yeah, I'm thinking again of the last part of Ilinka's talk, and that gets more into, I think, Proclus's own kind of, I don't know, it's not sure if I'd say aporeticism exactly, but I mean, the thing, the language of Odinis that still remain, the soul never reaches the one. But the interesting question I still wonder about is how much, Proclus is trying to still see, how much he still thinks the first hypothesis is enough, basically, for getting to describing something which the soul cannot really attain, and yet the first hypothesis is the basis from which the soul can understand these other things that follow. And what Damascius, I think what Damascius does, my sense is I think he puts the language of the Odinis he does also use with the Ineffable, and puts it outside the domain of the first hypothesis, outside all the hypotheses. That's an angle that I think it's not also been really talked about that much in the scholarship with Damascius. And the question, I think, in general, when looking at the way Damascius is reading the hypotheses with really pressing this question of language is, should we really try to take the ineffability of the principle seriously in such a way that you have to put it outside even that, the already negative theology you get in the first hypothesis? Another open question, I mean, we can also throw out for Ilinka too, is since she also had, I know she's worked a bit on Damascius too, is whether the Odinis that you get in that you get for the Ineffable in with Damascius, how much that applies to the one also, because it also seems like there's a lot of overlap there too, but that's a bit aside. But agreeing with you, George. Yeah. So, thank you.
Because it's not only the, if I may sort of follow up a little bit, it's not only the ineffability, it's namely that we cannot really talk about that, but it's also the impossibility of cognition, namely one aspect of reality, and indeed the most important aspect of reality is bound to remain sort of beyond our capacities of cognition, and that is something that we cannot really do anything about.
Yeah, I agree. I think that at least the way I've so far it's is how much is he really just trying to establish a base for an identifiable central single cause that we can talk about. So in a way, like, I thought the more interesting innovation with Damascius is that he sort of separates the ineffable aspect of the one from Proclus and just moves the one down to like a kind of, you could say, a sort of super henads. Because at least in Proclus, you have a way to identify traits or attributes of the henads while still treating them as unities. So they inherit these characteristics of being beyond being, having a kind of ineffable nature and so on. But he really tries to push this idea that, well, actually the one itself, it also encompasses those features if we take it in the sense of the beginning of the hypotheses. And then if that's the case, then you still have to treat the transcendence in what respect is it transcendent. If it's no longer transcendent absolutely, then you do have to posit this kind of difficulty you could never get over. At least that's how I've thought of it so far. But yeah, and I think it really maybe puts the difficulty that you highlight in frame.
Linka has a question, I think. Linka, please.
Thank you, Jonathan, for a great paper. And I was wondering, along the same lines, are Damascius and Proclus caught in the same dilemma, so to say, between transcendence and the principle, the causality of the principle, and between speaking and not speaking? And because I was thinking, and sort of going different ways within the same labyrinth without any hope of really getting out, so to say. Because I was thinking of Damascius, who at the point when he's talking about the ineffable, I think it's around page 6 or something in the Western Combes edition, where he says, if we search for Chireia, if we ask ourselves what is this ineffable good for, it is because everything went out from there as if from an adviton, but it went out in a completely different way, and I don't know how he puts it, hos aporeton, it brought forth aporetos ta panta homoios.
Yeah.
So basically, isn't that the same thing that Proclus does in the Platonic theology with this distinction between monet, prohodos, and epistrophe, and saying, well, the monet is in reality is the ineffable and incognoscible dimension of reality, and it reflects the actual core, so to speak, of the one. So Damascus kind of sort of takes this out with Iamblichus, of course, about whom we know so very little, unfortunately. And I'm one of those who are rather pessimistic about reconstructing Iamblichus 100% certainly. But are they playing with the same things and Proclus trying to make a more economical hypothesis out of what he gets, and Damascus going along the lines of Iamblichus, but being caught in the same, let's say, tensions of the very first principle or entity?
Yeah, I feel like it's very close to each other. I mean, my sense is maybe it's more a difference of degree, really. Because I could have asked myself with Damascius really using this language with a lot of the skeptical language, especially applied to the ineffable. I wonder, couldn't you just say the same with the way Proclus talks about the one? He doesn't really use that much in the language of this explicit overturning oneself, but you could do that, I would think. But then you also wonder, well, how much can you actually take the same entity as the subject of the first hypothesis, whether you can or cannot do that the way that Proclus sets it up. I think I see Damascius just basically asking these questions in Proclus's framework and trying to expand a bit on these like two different senses. That's why it's interesting to see him like engaging dialectically. If you say this, then we get to the ineffable. If you say that, then actually we have the one as the first identifiable thing, and there's some difference going on there. But yeah, this is it's basically, yeah, I follow you there.
Other questions?
Yeah, perhaps if I may. You've worked much more on Damascus than I have, but what would you say? Does the ineffable appear elsewhere after book one of De Principiis? Does it play any role? Because my sense is that you have it as a necessity, as a principle that you have to assume, although you cannot say anything about it, to have a metaphysically sound construction of your system. Then it shifts to the one and to the aporia of the one and its participability and all that sort of things. And then it goes on. But the areton basically disappears from the picture after the beginning, or does it still play a role in the later development?
Volume 2, yeah, it shows up again. Because from the beginning of Volume 2, it's another interesting thing with the De Principiis, the first volume. It's just really a number of just different abstract questions and aporia just raised about different aspects of, well, the principle taken simply in the ineffable, then the one. Beginning of Volume 2, that's when he gets into the doxography of Porphyry, Iamblichus, Proclus, Syrianus, so on. It shows up there when he assesses Proclus and Syrianus, and he thinks they make the mistake of collapsing those two principles of the ineffable and the one, and he thinks that basically pausing just the one by itself leads to the division into the unlimited and limits. But basically he thinks that it's at least to certain problems, basically, in this the way that he reconstructs their positions. So he just seems to treat the ineffable, as you have to posit it in the way that Iamblichus did, and Iamblichus is mostly right, but he has about 15 pages where he says, well, okay, some things that Iamblichus approved, like how he describes the limited and unlimited or things like that. But yeah, it shows up there, and I think it also shows up. It shows up in a few, I think briefly in the Philebus commentary and a few others. But Volume 2, especially the beginning, it's there.
Exactly, but as you said, not as a, let's say, an important driving force or anything of his system, of his questions, of the construction of reality later on. As you said in the doxography, where do you think that it's important for how he constructs his questions and especially also his solutions to the questions? Do you think it has a relevance for reality, so to say, as the one has, of course, throughout?
Yeah, well, it's when he's addressing Proclus and Syrianus, he thinks they make the mistake of cutting out or collapsing the ineffable and the one. He thinks there has to be a distinction. Otherwise, he thinks that by collapsing the two and just having an ineffable one, that just leads to there's no it's hard to see how the one doesn't become collapse and turn into the limited and unlimited. So he thinks if you want to maintain a distinction between the limits and unlimited, at least the way that Proclus does, then you have to posit a distinction between the ineffable and the one. But I think I otherwise agree. It's more incidental when he brings up the ineffable later on. He does say it you have to posit it in some way, but he doesn't really seem to do a lot at that point. I think it just depends on, again, the kind of questions he treats in the De Principiis. It really depends on the level that he's dealing with. Because when you get to the later part of Book 2 that he's dealing with, in what way do you talk about being and distinguishing between the unified and being, or are they the same, and so on. So I think it depends on the kind of the level that he's analyzing.
Thank you.
Further remarks, questions? Well, let me say one more thing, because I sort of I find this so very interesting. Namely, given this sort of impossibility to cognize, to get to know the one, the highest principle. This situation tells us something about ourselves, right? Namely, we learn something about our cognitive abilities. So in in our effort to cognize the highest principle and not succeeding, we learn something about ourselves, namely the limits of our cognition, the limits of our understanding. So there is a kind of, I think Philip of Man wrote a paper, a long paper at some point read about the Ineffable, in which he stresses exactly that, I think, namely the point of reversal, that sort of aiming to understand the highest principle, at the end we understand something about ourselves.
Yeah, I think my sense is I think he's trying to reframe Neoplatonic metaphysical science around, you could say, those limitations. And it's specifically within this processional hierarchy, because you take seriously that our knowledge is conditioned by the procession of those principles to the lower levels, then you really have to reorient how you approach those principles. And that's why it's really striking Damascius doesn't really have an axiomatic structure of metaphysics like you have with Proclus. And it's not just, of course, the elements of theology, but you see this, of course, in the Parmenides commentary and so on. So he's a lot more sensitive to, and that's why I think the dialectical method that you get in the De Principia piece really makes sense with how he's trying to approach it from the limits, as you're saying, of our knowledge, which is really because we're in the lower level. So those principles only manifest themselves in the mode of the receiver. And I think he's taking that basic Neoplatonist axiom from Proclus seriously. So what does it mean then? If we're only the participation is only the mode of the receiver, then how do you describe knowledge then of principles from that level?
But do you think that this is possibly also a way of knowing ourselves, and not only knowing sort of the reality around us? So by trying to know, by trying to get to know sort of metaphysics, the structure of reality, so to speak, we achieve another aim, learning something about ourselves.
It does intensify a Platonist theme there, that's for sure. And trying to know things in metaphysical reality, we know more about ourselves. And maybe you could say perhaps Damascius is even more of a Platonist in that sense, more towards Plato's method or Socrates' methods. So by inquiring, we know more about like where we are. It's more about than about attaining the actual principle, like you get in the Theaetetus or other aphoretic dialogues. So in that, maybe it goes more back towards that kind of approach.
Yes. Okay, thanks, Jonathan.